All right, we're just about the top of the hour. I want to welcome everybody. A lot of folks back for the next session here. It's great to see all the name. Rachel, this is like, this is your life for 30 minutes. So we get to learn all about you and hear the stories. And first of all, thanks for making some time. Appreciate it. I know you got a lot going on. So.
Sort of buried under the Usenix security review process right now because trying to chair that. We have 350 submissions this summer, which is a lot to deal with. So, yeah.
You know, before we even get into you, tell us a little bit about that. Like how, you know, we're all familiar with Usenix, and I always think of Usenix as both a community, an event, and the papers. I guess the community would be a little different, right? Not so much, at least face to face. Or do you think it will be face to face when?
Well, I'm chairing the 2021 event, which is supposed to be held in Vancouver, Canada in August. And I think we're still holding out hope that will happen. It may be, you know, while still being realistic that it might not, or it might need to at least be, you know, combined virtual and in person. As I was reflecting here on sort of what made me want to do my PhD, I mean, I think my first experience sort of going to conferences and engaging with other researchers about ideas and stuff was a big part of that. So it's definitely something that I'm missing now. But we do have, you know, all these security conferences have now moved to these multiple deadline models. We actually have 3 deadlines. This is the first of 3 for Usenix 2021. And tomorrow is the early reject notification, which is never the fun part. Yeah, but so it's a lot. It's kind of a whirlwind of a year of papers that you're kind of handling. And we actually, last summer, I think there was about 150 submissions. So 350 is a lot more than that. And I don't know how much that has to do with sort of COVID things in terms of things being pushed from the May deadline. Like you know, like CCS had a deadline May 3rd, which was sort of right in the scheme of how everyone was kind of figuring out what was going on. And so maybe we got, I think their submissions were down and ours were up. And so I don't know what's going to happen in October, which is our next deadline, but it's tricky because, you know, you want to have some idea of, for your program committee, you know, we have about 200 people that are helping review these papers, and they're all very busy and trying to make sure that, you know, papers get the peer review that they deserve, but also that the committee is not completely overwhelmed as well, and the community is not completely overwhelmed. So we've actually increased the size of the program committee, almost doubled this year. And we may need to increase it further just because the community, the security community, the security research community is growing so much. Anyway, that's probably more than you needed on that.
I mean, I think that's important. I know there's a lot of young people here. When I was starting out, I would be so sick to my stomach by negative comments on papers, but I saved them all. And in retrospect, going back, most of it was right. You know,
yeah.
At the time, you didn't think so. But as a developing researcher, it's really important to get not just papers accepted, but to get some things that get a little tough response back. That's part of your development, right?
Yeah, I think over time, as you know, you've had a longer research career and you've had things get published and have them, you know, get rejected and then ultimately accepted. You can kind of sort of start to appreciate those sort of negative reviews that make your work better in the long run, and then there are the negative reviews that are just wrong, you know. But the issue is like not to kind of assume it's going to be either one right away, right? Like to kind of just, you know, trying to have that detachment. And I think it's easier to do as a professor than it is as a grad student, because like your research project as a grad student is like your one baby, whereas as a professor you kind of spread it out a bit, so you're a little less emotionally attached to any given piece of work, though you still care, you know.
You know, it's funny, in way back in the Stone Ages, 1985, I was doing a master's thesis in formal methods. And my advisor said, why don't you take a chunk of this and send it to SIG plan notices, which wasn't refereed,
Mm.
And I was like, oh, okay, that sounds good. And he goes, it's, I got to warn you, there's a lot of junk that goes in there. It's not refereed, but whatever, this is pretty good stuff. So I sent it. And by some miracle, Edgar Dykstra sent something the same month. And I have a cover of SIG plan notices when I was just a literally master's student that has my name of the paper and then Dykstra's name right underneath. It's
That's pretty cool.
It's been downhill ever since. So it hasn't gone up from there. But
Well,
hey, listen.
yeah, no, yeah. So go on.
I was going to say, let's go back. I want to hear about you. Tell us
Okay,
about how you got interested in computer science and.
Yeah. So I was never like the kid who thought they would be in computer science. I barely, I think we had an Apple IIe growing up. And it's interesting because you can go back and I actually mentioned that you can cherry pick it, right? You can look at your background and be like, I was on this track the whole time. I can tell you stories about checking out a cryptography book from the library and like typing basic code into my little Apple IIe and like trying to make secret messages and then not finding anyone that wanted to play secret messages with me. So that didn't work very well. And then doing like a history project on like World War II cryptography and the war in the Pacific and interviewing some like former soldiers that had worked on that in the basement in Pearl Harbor and stuff like that. But I mean, at the time, that wasn't what I thought. I wanted to be an architect or maybe a science fiction writer or maybe a ballerina, but it became clear that that was not going to work out. So, I didn't really consider it seriously until I was in college. I got into MIT and I was excited to be an architecture student, like building buildings there. But I think I picked that institution more like because I was like, okay, this is a bunch of like nerdy people like me who would actually understand about the like basic messages in the computer and the science fiction books and not think I was weirdo because of that. So I think that was it. And I ultimately like needed to, it was 1997 when I started college. And so I recognized I had worked as a hostess in a restaurant the summer before college, and I needed to make some money to help pay those large tuition bills. And so I took a computer science class, both just to like learn what everyone was talking about. And I'm like, hey, if I take CS at MIT, I bet I can get a good summer job in the late 90s, which is true. So, and then, I realized that I really didn't like my architecture classes once I could start taking them. And I really enjoyed my programming classes, though I was still like really, nervous about it because like I hadn't been doing this that long. And, but, seemed to be going okay. And so I was like, I'll like, if I get a computer science degree from MIT, nobody's going to really think I'm like a failure. It'll be okay. I can work on this while I'm figuring out what I'm going to do with my life, and I'll just stay in school until I figure that out. And I'm still there. So it's kind of the answer.
I've never heard anybody want to apologize for a CS degree from MIT, but
yeah, so it worked out. And, in the context of internships, I discovered that like I liked taking classes in CS, and I enjoyed programming, but like the research was more fun for me. I had started to do some research projects like in the last couple of years of my degree. And so, I applied for PhD programs I did the master's while I was there. And, and then I went to Harvard.
Any sort of cybersecurity while you were at MIT?
Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, so I was interested in electronic voting, mostly because I was a Latin American studies, like we had to do a humanities concentration and I'd grown up in California. and I spoke Spanish, which is, my Spanish is not as good as it was when I was a kid, but it's because it's just atrophied a bit, but it's, and you read about all of, these sort of election all the things that can go wrong in elections, and and in the late 90s was very much this moment of like, can we make things better with cryptography and security?
Right.
So I went to Ron Rivest's office hours and I was like, I'm really interested in elections and security. Is there a way I can do like an undergraduate project with you? And he gave me like 2 CDs of like crypto and Eurocrypt over the independent activities period. And it was like, yeah, why don't you like read all the papers that are vaguely related to election security and do like a presentation for the group at the end and make like an annotated bibliography, we can see where to go. So this was January of 2000. And then the election in 2000 happens, right? And this is like the hanging Chad thing where, all of a sudden people became very much more interested in electronic voting because of the problems with paper voting. Of course, there's probably much more problems with electronic voting in a number of different ways. And, I'd spent some time talking about like the properties of electronic voting, which make it one of the just like the absolute hardest problems in computer security to address, because you need a certain degree of privacy and a certain degree of transparency and a certain degree of there's a lot of these different sort of receipt freeness and non-coercion, and all these things make it really difficult, especially with the complexity of computer systems and vulnerabilities. And so I haven't done much work since then in election security. Matt Blaze is doing really excellent work there.
He and I were working, I was at Bell Labs in those days. They had some cool stuff.
Yeah, but
Avi Rubin also really in that time was really doing cool work.
Yeah, but it was interesting because after the election, people would call up Ron Rivest and he'd be like, is any work going on at MIT about this? And it's like, well, we have this bibliography that an undergrad wrote, and
well, that's pretty good.
Yeah, so that was cool, and he was great to work with. And I mean, I always remember that, like, again, like, as an undergrad kind of cold calling him, he didn't like spend a lot of time with me, but he was like, sure, I will do this thing for you. And so I try and remember that when students approach me. And let's see.
So you went off to Harvard.
Yeah, I did. And I was doing some work on, I did some work on covert channels. I guess I had a group of friends that were very interested in kind of computer security and privacy, and the sort of the ways in which sort of computer security and was implicated in like sort of power relationships. And I'm married to Roger Dingledine, who's the founder of Tor, which was also happening around that time. So there's a lot of interesting discussions that definitely.
I invited Paul Syverson to my little conference last year to talk a little bit about Tor. Yeah. Next time I'll invite you and Roger come talk.
Yeah. But, So So then I went to Harvard, and I think that was the point where you watched the .com kind of implosion happen, and which was and it was a good time to be in school in some respects. A lot of people were doing that. It was sort of counter-cyclical, but it also kind of made people were really looking around to the what the business model of the internet was going to be, and there was this big kind of disillusionment because people really people in the late 90s were like, this is going to change the world, we're not quite sure how, and they were right. they hadn't quite figured out the details, but and there was this real belief that and it sounds naive now in retrospect of what's happened, but there was this belief that maybe moving our lives electronic could actually create more privacy and more anonymity. You probably remember this than it ever happened before. Yeah. And this sort of, the kind of electronic frontier, John Perry Barlow's stuff, all about that, sure. All this sort of hacker space kind of approach stuff, cypherpunks and things like that was
Right.
happening at that time, which was very exciting. But while I was in grad school was like the big disillusionment in some respects, because it became clear that the business model of the internet was going to be collecting information and building dossiers of people and selling it. And that was what was going to power our field. And it made me realize, and being at Harvard was a good place for this, because at MIT, there's definitely this view of like, engineer is king, like the tech is the center of the universe, code is law. I realized Larry was a Harvard person, but, you know. But that's kind of the ethos. And then realizing that no, like all this other stuff, like the economics and the policy and the like entrenched power interests, like are gonna matter for what happens with our field. And I got sort of involved with the like communities that were working on the economics of cybersecurity, and like the security and human behavior community, and the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, and sort of trying to look at these problems from an interdisciplinary perspective. Like, okay, we figured out how to do anonymous credentials. Why is the world not doing that, right? Like. So answering, I think I'm still trying to address that question a little bit. And yeah, so
what did you focus on while at Harvard?
So that was kind of there was some meandering, as there often is. So I did
Meandering is good, right, for
yes,
graduates?
Yeah, it is good.
Important.
And you know, and so like early on I did, you know, I'd done my, you know, my master's thesis on like covert channels and steganography and stuff like that, which is cool secret message stuff, right? And then again, I started to write to do some papers on the economics of information security and so on. And at the time, and I was interested in like how libraries could work to like validate against misinformation issues. Like if somebody, like we noticed, for example, that there was this issue of Time magazine where like there was Brent Snowcraft had some sort of op-ed about like not invading the Iraq, and that disappeared. And we were like, okay, if these things can memory hold themselves when we don't have like archives, when we're dealing with digital things, like how are libraries gonna like coordinate to validate information? And so we had some interesting, like I did some work on that. But at some point I was kind of like, okay, I'm actually still getting a computer science PhD. And at this point, like all this stuff that I'm doing that's sort of soft and fluffy, I'm concerned it won't be too respected. So I wanted to look for something for my dissertation that was going to be more technical. And at the time, I actually, the Department of Homeland Security had been formed, and I had applied and gotten one of their first fellowships. And one of the requirements for that was that you do like an internship. And I did one at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which was a little disappointing in a lot of ways because the project that I was supposed to work on had gotten cut like right before I showed up, but I was still there. So it was kind of like, okay, and I kind of just worked on some of my researchy things and my quals over that summer. But so I decided to do a second one, and I actually went to USC, and I got to work with Milan Tombe, he was part of the I think it was the Kalo project. There was a big DARPA project that eventually, like the technology from that, like became like Siri, right? It was all about kind of personal assistive agents, and they were modeling this in their lab, and they were like, well, they had started to realize they had this little system, prototype system called Electric Elves that was supposed to help you like schedule meetings and stuff, right? Something we all do now. And they started to realize that like it was really causing a lot of friction in their lab because it stripped away the privacy that people had and the polite little lies that people tell each other, like, I'm sorry, I'm late for the meeting because I'm stuck in traffic. It's like, no, you're not. You're sitting in the Dunkin' Donuts over there, and like, because your GPS is telling me through this agent, or or when and people mentioning that when they didn't want to have meetings and so on, and whose meetings were prioritized over whose others' meetings, and it was causing all this difficulty, and so they I came in to look at like the privacy issues, and I ended up doing my dissertation on that. It was kind of how you think about privacy in the context of distributed constraint reasoning, which like nobody actually uses distributed constraint reasoning for scheduling now because it's like too complex. But I think it was an interesting point, and I was very excited because I was like, okay, this AI stuff is coming, and nobody's deployed any of it yet, and nobody's thought about privacy and security issues. I remember going to my first AMAS or AAAI, and I remember talking to some of my security buddies afterwards. I'm like, these guys, they're doing such cool stuff, but they have not thought about threat models at all. And this was like 2005, 2006, right? And it became clear that like, okay, thinking about how AI was going to work with privacy and security was going to be a big thing eventually. Though I still had to kind of sell people on that at the job market at the time because it was not obvious. But yeah,
well, 15 years ago, living at the cross section of AI, privacy, and security, pretty good place to be.
Yeah. It kind of worked out, right? I think that you do have to, like, I remember people asking, like, why are you doing this like risky stuff? Economics and security, AI and security, like, if you just stay in like the systems lane or whatever, you're gonna, but like, it doesn't work, right? Like you have to do the thing that you think is interesting, that is the problem that you care about, the problems that you care about that you think are going to matter for the world. Because at least for me, otherwise I just get bored and the work isn't any good,
I mean, one good thing about NYU is that interdisciplinary kind of spirit is very, very
and that
clear.
That was a huge, that was a huge draw for me when I decided to come here in 2019, so jumping forward. So I got a job. I did at Drexel University, and that was when I started to work. I got a really excellent group of like PhD students to start, which is like super. It's one of those like super fortunate like things that happens. And I also realized that was just like the best thing in the world, is like collaborating with PhD students on research is just amazing.
How'd you like living in Philly? Was that all right?
I like Philly,
I did too. I was like,
I'm definitely like, I grew up in the West Coast, and I hate driving a lot.
Yeah.
And so the East Coast is a big win for me in that regard. Like the density of the cities, which, right now in the COVID times has maybe got some issues, but like still ultimately hate driving. So, but love mountains. So that's the one thing that's.
Tell us a little, since you come to New York, and part of NYU, tell us about your work and what some of your students.
Yeah. So I think I'm still kind of. So a lot of my work has been around this idea of what can you identify people from, like the things that they write or type online, and in particular we've been looking at doing source code attribution from these sorts of things, and also and I'd actually I've been collaborating with Damon on that, and that was kind of one of our, and we worked together looking at whether we could identify people on underground forums across different accounts when they were talking about cybercrime things and stuff like that. So we'd worked on this, and now I've been looking at code,
Rachel,
and binary.
if someone is aware that you're doing this, on a surface level, I would think that defeating the detection would seem, I probably know 0.01% enough to even comment on this, It seems
But
like it would be
can
easy
you
to
fool these
defeat.
things? Yes.
Yeah, it seems like you
Absolutely.
should be
And
able
in
to
fact,
fool.
my very first paper on this subject was about that, right? Was
Yeah.
let's not contribute to stylometry, let's break it. And we showed that, yeah, like if
Yeah.
people try and change their writing style, they can do so effectively. But if they don't, it's tremendously identifying,
Predictable. Yeah.
predictable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it was an interesting result in that regard. And it's also, we also showed that like when people try and change their writing style, if they're not doing it, you know, algorithmically, if they're just doing it as a human, they may be hard to identify, but the fact that they're being deceptive, there's usually a signature there, because people change the things that are um, like are more salient to humans, right? Like, so the bigger word choices and things like that, and the structure of the sentences. But little things like function word choices, like, you know, if you've ever done the like trying to identify the number of ofs in a paragraph, it's really hard because we just like ignore them. And that stuff is not hugely discriminative by itself, but like there's an interesting signature that happens when people try and change things, but they leave those things alone and stuff like that. So it's interesting that can happen. And we've actually been looking at it in the context of code with abstract syntax trees. So there's
Yeah.
and Casey, who's on the call here or was, is working on some, whether this can really be applied to help us find out malware. I'm also really interested in social media and like content curation algorithms.
Yeah.
And Damon and I are working together on that, like understanding, like thinking about it as an adversarial machine learning problem, which it is, right? Like you want to game this like this algorithm that's going to promote your content, and how do you go about fooling it and creating, you know, plausible engagements and things like that, and what works and how are people doing this in practice. So I think that's really interesting and also related. And then I have this other project where I'm actually collaborating with social scientists on understanding spyware and intimate partner violence and how that gets connected. Again, with Damon, you talked about that a little bit, but also trying to understand the value of anonymity. Like when people contribute to projects like Wikipedia or do things online using Tor, trying to be anonymous, they definitely have a bad reputation, but how much of that is earned, and how much, and what are the good things that are happening with anonymity that make it lost if you block it? So how can you measure that and things like that? So
you had a nice Oakland
nice
paper. I saw
yeah,
your Oakland paper.
that's the one on
What was the finding? Like when people are
right.
posting to the
So
Wikipedia,
ultimately
what'd you find?
we found that like when you looked at Tor users who had successfully edited Wikipedia pages, which they're not allowed to do, but like the ban has not been perfectly effective, and we found like 10,000 edits, right? So they're very comparable to other people who are not logged in, who are just editing with IP addresses, in terms of the level of quality of the edits and the proportion of them that are vandalism, and also very similar to first-time users of Wikipedia, so first-time editors. So, and it's interesting that because of the ban, you know, that's where you'd expect them to be, because they're not going to be editing long-term enough to actually develop a, you know, a reputation and become a better editor, right? So, but the point is that these editors are sometimes producing quite useful content, and aren't necessarily creating badness at any higher level than other people that aren't logged in. So that was what we found.
Now, for some of the folks who are listening and would like to know a little bit about, you know, the PhD program that you or the students you're working with right now, how do you work? Are you actively soliciting students right now, and what would be the experience?
Yeah, I am absolutely looking for students. We'll be hopefully admitting a couple of students in the winter. I have it's a little confusing to count my students, because I just graduated Edwin from Drexel, so I don't actually have any active students at Drexel, because Avi, who worked with me, is going to primarily be working with someone else now. But I have 5 students at NYU, 4 of which moved with me from Drexel, and We have a number of different projects. I have a new project that just got recommended for funding with Damon from NSF. So we're very excited to kind of get started on that. We'll be looking for some students that are good fits for this work. So.
Oh, that's exciting. So 2
Yeah.
years in New York City now. How have you liked being in New York?
Well, 2020 has been different from 2019 for sure.
It's a weird year. It's
Yeah. I mean, if you'd asked me this
weird.
last year, I would have talked about like Broadway and being able to take ballet classes at the Joffrey and going to all these cool restaurants and everything. And now I'm like, well, it was really nice when I lived in Philly and I had 2 bathrooms, you know. But I do like New York still. Yeah, and I have hopes for the city's getting back on its feet and us getting through this time and so on. And it
It's
has,
still not entirely clear what the university or any university is doing. A couple of them in California made their call.
Right. I
I'm
think,
still not sure where it is.
I think we're still going to see. I was very glad to see that the decision that was made about the immigration rules, so that we don't have to.
Yeah, that was
so we don't have to
horrifying.
necessarily, like, as I was sitting there trying to figure out how to make my large class some sort of blended experience and being like, this is not the right thing, because I'm going to be teaching the intro to cybersecurity and in the fall, which is typically, it was 125 students when I taught it last time, which is not really appropriate for social distancing.
No.
So yeah, it should be an online course. And I loved my seminar that I taught in the spring, and I don't know, and it was just a fabulous group of students talking and reading privacy papers. So I'm hoping to get a chance to do that again.
Those are usually small enough that you can find a way to get.
Yeah,
like,
and I mean, we did it on Zoom,
out.
and it was fine because it was small in a lot of ways. So yeah, if the class is small, you can do a lot of things. But I think we're thinking, we're thinking it through this summer. So hopefully we'll be able to do something pretty intentional about the classes in the fall. So.
Well, Rachel, if people want to be in touch with you, I assume your email is probably the best way for them to send you a note.
That's true. I'm also on Twitter, so that's a great way. I hope this wasn't too meandering. And
it's the whole idea was for it to be relaxed and meandering. That's the whole idea.
All right,
so
thanks.
I thought it was great. It went by in about 30 seconds. So
I was like, oh wait, we should talk about my research. Oops, there's like 2 minutes.
We're going to do another batch in the fall. We'll include you. We'll do part 2. So Rachel, on behalf of everyone, I want to thank you for taking time, and thanks everybody for joining. We'll let you know. We're going to plan another batch. These have been pretty popular, so we'll make sure we get everybody involved. And Rachel, stay healthy, and we'll see you.
Thanks for organizing this
and
setting it up.
It was fun. I'll talk to you later. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you guys.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.